To begin proceedings, we have a first panel on trade and diplomacy. And to begin the day, it's my very great pleasure to introduce you to one of the stars of the Crawford School at the ANU, Dr. Shiro Armstrong, who's going to talk about Asia's response to uncertainty in the global trading system. Dr. Armstrong.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you to the QUT staff for inviting me. And it's a real privilege for me to kick off the day's proceedings with what I hope is a bit of broader context for our discussions today. So I want to talk a bit about Asia's response to basically Trump, or the uncertainty in the global trading system, and to, I think, explain why there's a real threat. It hasn't gone away just because Trump hasn't fulfilled his campaign promises, and then to talk about Asia's interests and what Asia should do in response. So let me start with some broader context that I think is familiar to everybody. We've had very slow economic recovery from the global financial crisis. This has led to a wave of protectionist sentiment, anti-globalization, populism that's led to the rise of President Trump. It's created huge uncertainty in US policymaking, US strategy, domestic and international. But also it's not confined to the United States. The slow recovery from the global financial crisis, I think a big underlying reason why we've had Brexit and some of the troubles within Europe internally. And these, I think, are not temporary phenomenon, that we're going to be with these issues for a while. They're generational issues that take a while to fix up, and I'll get to that. So what I want to talk about, and the message I want to leave with you, this is not business as usual. The crisis hasn't gone away, and I think we should be pretty alert and careful and strategic in our response. So I want to talk about Asia's response to this phenomenon, but first I think I might talk about the US threat. So the US created and led and indeed underpinned world order, including the WTO and previously the GATT, the World Trading System, created by the United States, is now under threat from the United States. So we've had US withdraw from TPP. That's the one campaign promise that President Trump has fulfilled. But as I mentioned, I think the problems that led to Trump's rise are structural, and they'll take a generation to fix up. The unemployment in the Rust Belt, the education system in parts of the United States, the lack of healthcare coverage, and in general, the lack of a social safety net, a robust social safety net, has led to an increase in inequality in the United States. So really, Trump brings a retreat to bilateralism, away from multilateralism and leadership, and it's quite clear that Trump and his trade policy team, including his so-called economists in his administration, think that imports cost jobs. Very mercantilist approach, and trade deficits are bad. So this is a big worry. So far, only TPP, as I've mentioned, but a lot of threats during the campaign. 45% tariff on China, 35% tariff on some Mexican products, and threats about withdrawal from the WTO even, that should have us all quite worried. Now, these haven't come to fruition, and I think we should all be grateful, but there are a number of scenarios you can think about where there might be a lot of pressure on Trump and his team to whack a big tariff on Chinese imports beyond steel and a few commodities. One that I've listed here is the US Federal Reserve now going into a tightening cycle, raising interest rates. That's going to appreciate the US dollar and make US exports even less competitive. And that's not going to help bring back any jobs to the Rust Belt. Not that they're going to come back anyway. And it's worth mentioning these, as we all probably know, they're not trade issues so much as technology issues, and the inability of US and some other countries to spread the benefits of technological progress and openness to trade and investment, and to undertake the structural adjustments necessary. So before USTR, US Trade Representative Lighthizer came in, the USTR put out a trade policy agenda for this year. It had some pretty worrying language about the United States is only going to abide by dispute resolution rulings if it's in their favour. And this is a very big departure and a very big threat to the global trading system. The rules-based order, we haven't had a liberalising round. Doha's stalled and failed, but the dispute settlement mechanism's the one part that's robust and active and underpinning trade globally. So Lighthizer, the new USTR, was part of the team, Reagan's team, that put on massive countervailing duties against Japan in the 80s, and he's been in the press in the last 24 hours talking about China's not a market economy, and nothing particularly new, but I think is the extreme end of that spectrum we've seen in the US over the last couple of decades. I won't get into the border adjustment tax, but that's also a potential destabilising force if it comes to fruition. This is the tax reform plan by the House Republican leadership. It's actually, I think, pretty decent tax reform on paper, but it potentially has very devastating effects for trade in the short term and the longer term. So what should Asia's response be? First I want to talk briefly about Asia's interests. So Asia, and here I'm talking about East Asia broadly, but also India and parts of South Asia, are growing much faster than the global average. Still a dynamic part of the global economy, one of the growth engines of the global economy. And just thinking about China, the increment it adds each year to global GDP is by far the largest. And then we've got India, Indonesia and others, which are going to be growing at a fairly rapid pace for the foreseeable future, we hope. And they have the highest growth potential. But all these countries have very big and difficult reform programs. China with its supply-side reforms, moving from investment-led to consumption-led growth. Japan and its third arrow, Abenomics structural reform agenda. India with its Make in India program and opening up. These are all reform programs that are required to sustain high growth and increase living standards. For India, Indonesia and others, it's about getting to middle income, high middle income, and then avoiding the middle income trap. And for China, it's about achieving high incomes and avoiding a middle income trap and getting stagnant. But we have a reform agenda here in Australia that's also difficult, moving away from a heavy reliance on natural resources to more higher value add manufacturing and services. So these reform programs in the region are difficult enough as they are, without a hostile external environment of markets closing up in Europe and the United States. So I think there's a deep interest there. The WTO, the multilateral system, has underpinned our economic integration in the region. And our largest trading partners in Northeast Asia, Japan, China, South Korea, we were already having very robust, large relationships, trade relationships with them before our free trade agreements. You think about the Japan-China economic relationship. There's a lot of political mistrust and unresolved history. That's the third largest trading relationship in the world. There's no way you can explain that without understanding China's commitment to the WTO gave confidence for Japanese, American and other investors and traders to deal with China. And the rules in the dispute settlement mechanism underpinning that. So the rare earth metal case where China was cleaning up its domestic industries and supposedly had an export embargo against Japanese exports of rare earth metals to Japan. Instead of retaliation by Japan, that was resolved in the WTO. China lost the case and China accepted the case. Japan, US, EU took China to court there. Talking to a group of law professors, I should be careful with my language. So I think it has economic as well as political security implications. WTO is a framework that's really held the region together. So I think what should the responses be? Well, first, it's worrying about what we should do domestically at home before we think about the regional architecture. And I'll talk about the regional stuff in a second. But I think the clear lessons from Brexit and Trump have been that the social protections are important. You know, wherever you lie on the political spectrum, I think this has been a lesson rammed home for all of us. The importance of social protections, a social safety net, and not trade protection. So I think that countries that do social protection better do trade openness better. And it's important to have that tax and transfer system and adjustment packages that help the adjustment, not to delay and impede adjustment that's necessary. So I think that's a very important lesson. Another one that I think gets overlooked quite often is the macroeconomic framework and how important that is. To keep the economy at full employment, to have the institutions to do so, a floating exchange rate, an independent reserve bank, the churn in the labour market is going to be there's rapid churn anyway, but at full employment, those who lose jobs can find new jobs much more easily. I think Australia has done relatively well. We've resisted the wave of protectionism domestically. That's largely because not just our political system and our compulsory voting, but importantly our egalitarian institutions. So I think they're two pretty important lessons to learn. But what can we do in the region? So Australia protecting itself, maintaining openness by itself, is not going to save the world or even save us. If markets are closing up all around us, we're in trouble. So I think it's quite clear that Asia, given its growth I talked about, and the reform agendas to maintain living standards, in fact to grow living standards, I think there's a strong interest, a responsibility, and even the size of the region itself, China, India, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia and Southeast Asia, has the ability to lead on economic integration, actually make a difference and be a positive force for good against the United States. Especially in the case of closing up of markets and big protectionist measures, but even just creating more stability and certainty in the global trading system and the global economy. But looking around the region, who's going to lead? So the United States has led for the last 7 decades and then some, but it's not obvious that there's a natural leader in the region. So given the size and weight of China, we'd expect China to play a big leadership role, and any collective grouping is going to require Chinese participation and leadership, but I don't think China can do it alone. China's not ready for that kind of leadership, still a developing country, and we're clearly not ready for Chinese leadership. We're unable to sign a non-binding MOU on the Belt and Road Initiative with China. There's deep sort of suspicion and uncertainty still about China's ability to lead in the region, rightly or wrongly. So I think it's got to be collective leadership and looking for coalitions of open economies that really want to double down on the global system. And we need to do that not just by traditional market opening and sending all the right signals. It's got to be much more than Xi Jinping standing up at Davos saying the right things. It's got to be making progress in difficult areas, in investment and services, where a lot of the action is, but also looking at the new issues like cross-border data flows and e-commerce, where the dynamism is in the global economy. And I think I'll get on to the TPP and then RCEP, but just before I do, I think in thinking about what we do in the region, what we do globally, it's important to keep whatever we do open to the United States and to Europe and the rest of the world. It's not a time to become inward-looking and have a regional bloc that cuts off the United States. It has to not just appear to be open to eventual US membership and not to damage US interests in the meantime, but to be structurally open so that the United States can join. So just on the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, there's been a lot in the press about Australia, New Zealand and Japan, especially New Zealand and Japan, wanting to push for a TPP 11. So it's a TPP minus the United States. This is after a lot of hand-wringing and Japan initially saying TPP without the United States is meaningless, we're not going to proceed. And now Japan's changed its mind and wants to make the most of what it can, of what's left over. I think it still is quite, perhaps not meaningless, but a completely different ballgame without the United States. So I've said here, if we're successful with a TPP 12 minus X, because I don't know what the number's going to be, it could be TPP 4, TPP 11, TPP 3. It'll be TPP in name only. And why do I think this? Well, importantly, the size of the United States in the TPP, the sheer dominance of the US, and the way it negotiated. So it negotiated bilaterally with every other member. And so it's a real hub and spokes deal, and you take the hub out of a hub and spokes deal, it's going to have to be a lot of reinventing of this agreement. It's not just changing the ratification rules of having 85% GDP and trade necessary within the grouping for the TPP to come into force, but I think it needs a complete rethink, because countries like Vietnam, Malaysia and others really signed up to this and signed up to rules and standards that are not necessarily in their interests. In fact, some of them are quite dangerous, and expect them to leapfrog stages of development. But they did this because they were going to get US market access, and that's huge for some of these smaller economies. So the bargain really was rules and standards imposed on these other countries for US market access. You take that away, I think it's a different equation. Have to rethink. So I think without the US market access and without the biggest economy being part of it, the content, character and structure will change. So said here, the best case for the TPP is it becomes an organ donor. We can harvest the organs from the TPP. A lot of political capital has gone into negotiating this thing, and there's actually some good in there, a lot of good in there. Some chapters are really at the cutting edge. Market access commitments that were made, why don't countries pick those up and implement them unilaterally? It's difficult to do. The politics is not easy, but now's a good time to double down on openness and send a pretty clear signal. So take what you can unilaterally and implement. What you can't and you think is good, you get a collection of countries together to get, say, data flows or e-commerce agreement up, implant that into the RCEP agreement, for example. But I think not just throwing the whole thing away, there's been too much invested in this to ignore it and bury it. There are reasons, I think, to take parts of it, and that'll keep pressure on RCEP to be more ambitious at the end of the day. So the best case scenario, in my view, is if we are going to spend time and energy and political capital in trying to save the TPP in whatever form, is to, given we're going to have to renegotiate a lot of it, is to almost go back to scratch and start with something that looks like the P4, the original P4 agreement, that's much more open, liberalising, transparent. It's before the United States joined and started making it all about IP, ISDS and all the other things that we're not so comfortable with. And that, importantly, whatever we do has to be open to accession by not just the United States, but China, Indonesia, and others that want to join. So there's got to be a force, a positive force that's more dynamic than I think we thought of the TPP, which was a one-shot game, sign up or don't, and sign up to these high rules on day one or get punished. But I think where the real action is going to be and where we should put our energy and focus is on the RCEP agreement. And really, if you think about what I've talked about, the dynamism, the scale of the Asian economies, natural place is to find a grouping within East Asia that includes India. It's not natural to think about India as part of a coalition of liberalising open economies. It's played spoiler in previous agreements, multilateral and otherwise. And it is currently dragging its feet in RCEP and slowing the whole thing down. But I think, and I hope, India will come to a realisation that it exactly aligns with its reform program to make in India, to bring more foreign investment in, and to build up the manufacturing that it needs, and to integrate into East Asia. So I think I've mentioned already we need collective leadership. I think that collective leadership has to come from ASEAN, and ASEAN's not cohesive enough or not large enough to carry the day. It's really got to come from a group that involves China, Japan as two key necessary forces within that leadership. And RCEP already exists. We're negotiating there. I think this is a natural partnership with all its problems. This is the platform that the region can use to push back against the uncertainty in the protectionism in the United States and Europe. It can set the standards for the free trade area of Asia and the Pacific, which we're thinking about down the track and which TPP was going to be a big part of. But I think importantly what goes missing here is it provides cover for countries to make real progress on difficult issues with bilateral partners that they find difficult to deal with. So just as the TPP was, I think, bilateral, was cover, we were all cover for the US doing a big deal with Japan. It was too difficult for Japan to do a big bilateral deal with the United States. It still is. Japan's having a lot of trouble. And if you look at the size and the structure of the agreement, I think, we're all sort of on the sidelines, a bit of leftovers for the US and Japan. In the same way, I think RCEP can provide the cover for India and China to make some pretty big progress between them, Japan and China, for example, because you can't see these countries making much progress in a bilateral setting, let alone, say, a China, Japan, Korea trilateral setting. Although I think now is the time where we take what we can, we look at all the groupings in the region, China, Japan, Korea, hope to make progress there that's consistent with RCEP progress. Have to fashion our bilateral deals that we're negotiating currently with India and Indonesia, which I think are of second order, if not third order importance. Use them strategically to get better outcomes within a broader regional grouping like RCEP. So it's a fair bit to hope for, but I think we should still be worried and vigilant about what the United States is going to do. If the jobs don't come back before the midterms, there's real risk of a big shock to the system. Now's the time to double down and invest in the global trading system. Great, thank you.